Welcome to dreamy history. Imagine the wind, ancient and ceaseless, sweeping across a sea of grass. This isn't just any grass, it's the Eurasian steppe, a colossal ribbon of prairie stretching for thousands of miles from the Carpathian Mountains all the way to Mongolia, and at its western edge, cradled between the Carpathians and the Black Sea, lies a land that has been, for millennia, a stage for some of humanity's most dramatic movements, what we know today as Ukraine. This land, often called the quote, zero, a fertile crescent that could feed empires, has paradoxically been a constant battleground, a magnet for invaders and a crucible for cultures. It's a place where the deepest roots of Slavic identity intertwine with the nomadic echoes of Scythians, Sarmatians, and Goths, creating a tapestry so rich and complex it defies simple categorization. For centuries, this region was less a fixed nation and more a vast open frontier, a Jike pole, a wild field where empires clashed, and new ways of life were forged in the crucible of constant change. It's a land whose very soil is layered with the dust of countless civilizations, each leaving its mark, often violently, always profoundly. If you're enjoying this journey through history, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And I'm always curious. Drop a comment letting me know what city and time zone you're watching from. There's something special about knowing this story is reaching people all over the world, from quiet evenings to early mornings. Here's the thing that blows my mind about Ukraine. Its very existence, its identity, is a testament to an almost unimaginable resilience, forged over thousands of years in a landscape that was both a blessing and a curse. This isn't a story that begins with a clear, defined nation-state. No, to understand Ukraine we have to dig much deeper, into the very earth itself, into the whispers of cultures long gone, whose spirits still haunt the vast fertile plains. Before anything resembling Ukraine or even Slavic existed, this land was home to astonishing civilizations. Imagine for a second communities thriving here over 6,000 years ago. We're talking about the Satrapillian culture, which flourished from roughly 4,500 to 3,000 BCE. These weren't scattered hunter-gatherers. They built enormous proto-cities, some housing up to 15,000 people, like the site near Khmelnytsky, covering over 250 hectares. They practiced advanced agriculture, created sophisticated pottery, and, in a genuinely peculiar ritual, periodically burned down their entire settlements and rebuilt them from scratch. We don't fully understand why, but it suggests a complex spiritual life tied to the land and cycles of renewal. Then, centuries later, the landscape shifts dramatically with the arrival of the Scythians. Around the 7th century BCE, these were the quintessential nomadic horse archers, masters of the steppe, whose presence defined the region for nearly 400 years. Their domain stretched from the Don River to the Danube, encompassing the majority of modern Ukraine. They weren't farmers, they were warriors and herders, living in felt tents on wagons, moving with their vast herds across the endless grass. Their legacy isn't in cities, but in the thousands of burial mounds or kurhans that still dot the Ukrainian steppe, containing astonishing gold artifacts, intricate animal-style jewellery, weapons and ceremonial objects, reflecting a sophisticated metallurgy and a rich spiritual world centred on horses and hunting. Herodotus, the Greek historian, described them with a mix of awe and fear, noting their ferocity and their unusual customs, including drinking from the skulls of their enemies. The Scythians weren't isolated. They engaged in robust trade with the Greek colonies established along the Black Sea coast, places like Olbia and Chersonesus. They exchanged grain, furs, and enslaved people for Greek wine, pottery, and manufactured goods. This interaction wasn't always peaceful, but it certainly enriched both cultures, particularly evident in the Scythian goldwork that blends nomadic motifs with Hellenic craftsmanship. Think of the famous pectoral from Tovstomohyla, a masterpiece of gold from the 4th century BCE, depicting a vibrant scene of animals and human figures weighing over 2 pounds of pure gold. It's a testament to immense wealth and artistry, found in a kurhan near Pokrov, Dnipropetrovsk Oblast in 1971. Following the Scythians from the 3rd century BCE came the Sarmatians, another Iranian-speaking nomadic people. They were culturally similar but distinct, known perhaps most famously for their formidable female warriors. Historians and archaeologists increasingly link Sarmatian women to the ancient Greek myths of the Amazons, as their burial mounds frequently contain women interred with weapons and armour. This region truly was a dynamic crucible where cultures met, clashed, and merged. The steppe itself acted as a colossal highway, a super route for migrations and invasions, a funnel through which countless peoples passed. Cimmerians, Scythians, Sarmatians, Goths, Huns, Avars, Khazars, Pechenegs, Cumans, Mongols. Each wave left behind genetic, linguistic, and cultural traces, creating an incredibly rich, albeit often turbulent, historical substrate. The idea of a fixed, unchanging landscape simply doesn't apply here. It's a land of constant flux, shaped by the relentless westward push of peoples from Asia. By the 4th century CE, the steppe saw another seismic shift with the arrival of the Goths, a Germanic people who established a powerful kingdom. But their dominance was short-lived, shattered by the terrifying westward advance of the Hun in the late 4th century. This period of upheaval, often called the migration period, was crucial for the ancestors of the Ukrainians. Amidst this chaos, the Slavic peoples, who had previously lived as forest zones north of the steppe, began to expand. They weren't the horse-riding warriors of the steppe. They were settled agriculturalists moving into the fertile forest steppe zone, that crucial transition belt where the deep forests gave way to open plains. This ecological niche provided both resources and a degree of protection from the relentless nomadic incursions. They established small unwalled settlements, cultivating grains and living in semi-subterranean dwellings known as poludemlianki. This distinction between the open nomadic steppe and the more settled agrarian forest steppe is absolutely fundamental to understanding the future of Ukraine. It's in this forest steppe, from the 5th to the 8th centuries, that the various East Slavic tribes began to coalesce, developing distinct dialects and customs. These were the Drevlians, the Polans, the Severians, the Ulichs, and the Tivertsians, names that will echo through the early chapters of Ukrainian history. They were not yet united, often warring amongst themselves, but they were laying the groundwork, establishing permanent communities, and slowly pushing the frontier of settled life further south into the very heart of the ancient wild fields. So, we've journeyed through millennia, from Tripilian farmers to Scythian gold, from Sarmatian Amazons to the first tentative steps of Slavic settlement. We've seen a land defined by its incredible fertility and its equally immense vulnerability, a place where cultures constantly arrived, clashed and fused. But how did these disparate Slavic tribes living in their scattered forest settlements eventually come to form something larger, something that would eventually become one of the most powerful states in medieval Europe? That, my friends, is where our next chapter truly begins, with the arrival of a new powerful force from the north and the birth of Kyivan Rus. We left off with the East Slavic tribes, those Drevlians, Polans and others, slowly, painstakingly, laying down roots in the fertile forest steppe. They were farmers, building small unwalled settlements, quietly cultivating their land in their unique ways. But the Jaik Pole, that wild field, was never truly quiet. It was a colossal highway, remember? A funnel, drawing in new peoples, new ambitions, new challenges. And as the 9th century dawned, a new force arrived. Not from the open steppe to the south, but from the icy seas of the north, the Varangians. Now, when I say Varangians, I'm talking about Norsemen, Vikings, if you will. These weren't just any adventurers. They were a dynamic, restless people driven by a thirst for trade, plunder, and new horizons. They weren't just about raiding. They were about roots. And the most famous of these, the one that blows my mind with its sheer ambition, was the, quote, "Imagine this, a vast network of rivers, lakes, and portages stretching from the Baltic Sea down the mighty Dnipro, all the way to the glittering capital of the Byzantine Empire, Constantinople, or Miklagard, as the Norse called it. It was a lifeline, a superhighway of its time, connecting Scandinavia to the heart of the civilized world. Our Slavic ancestors, with their scattered settlements and decentralized communities, were ripe for interaction, sometimes violent, often transformative, with these newcomers. The Varangians, with their long ships and their battle axes, initially appeared as raiders demanding tribute, but they quickly saw the potential for more. They weren't just conquerors, they were also shrewd merchants, skilled navigators, and eventually state builders. The traditional story, the one that echoes through the annals of history, tells of the Slavic and Finnic tribes in the north, weary of internal strife, sending an invitation across the sea. Quote, Chapter 2. And so, in 862 CE, according to the primary chronicle, the Varangian chieftain Rurik and his brothers answered the call, establishing their rule in Novgorod. But here's where the story gets truly exciting for our Ukrainian narrative. Rurik's successor, Ole, or Oleg, as you might know him, was a man of immense vision and even greater ambition. He wasn't content with just Novgorod. He looked south, down that colossal ribbon of the Dnipro, and saw the strategic prize. Kyiv. It's not just a city, it's a living testament to millennia of history. Perched on those high green banks overlooking the Dnipro, it was already a significant trading post. A crossroads where forest met steppe, where north met south. In 882 CE, Ole marched south, seized Kyiv, and in a moment that reverberated through history declared it the mother of Rus's cities. That, my friends, is where our next chapter truly begins. The scattered East Slavic tribes, those nascent communities we talked about, now had a powerful, centralized force to contend with and eventually to coalesce around. This was the birth of Kyivan Rus. Imagine the scene. The longships of the Varangians, now the ruling elite, gliding down the Dnipro, their sails catching the wind. the bustling markets of Kyiv, filled with the chatter of Slavic dialects mingling with Old Norse, the scent of pine and river water, the glint of steel and the sheen of silk from Byzantium. Kyivan Rus was a multi-ethnic, multicultural state from its very inception. It was a crucible where Slavic agricultural traditions, Norse military and administrative prowess, and Byzantine cultural influence would blend to forge something entirely new. Ole and his successors, the early Rus princes, embarked on a monumental task, unifying the disparate East Slavic tribes. They established a system of tribute collection, the Poliudi, where the prince and his retinue would travel through the lands, collecting furs, honey, wax, and slaves. It was a harsh system, yes, but it was also a way to assert authority, to bring order, and to integrate these diverse groups into a nascent state. The economic engine of Kyivan Rus was, without a doubt, trade with Byzantium. The Dnipro River wasn't just a geographical feature, it was the very artery of the state. Furs from the northern forests, honey and wax from the wildlands, and slaves captured from various tribes flowed south, exchanged for Byzantine luxuries, silks, spices, wine, and crucially silver and gold. This connection to the sophisticated Byzantine Empire wasn't just economic, it was a conduit for culture, art, and most profoundly religion. For centuries, the Slavic peoples of Rus worshipped a pantheon of pagan gods. Perun, the god of thunder and lightning, was paramount, reflecting the power of nature. Veles, associated with cattle and the underworld, held sway over wealth and the harvest. Their worship involved idols, sacred groves, and sacrifices. It was a deeply animistic faith, rooted in the land, its seasons, and its cycles of life and death. But as Rus grew, as its princes engaged with the Christian Empire to the south, the limitations of paganism became increasingly apparent for a state seeking to establish itself on the international stage. The shift didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual process, marked by both political pragmatism and genuine spiritual searching. The first significant step came with Princess Olha, a figure of incredible strength and cunning, after her husband, Prince Ihor, was brutally murdered by the Drevlians for demanding excessive tribute. A cautionary tale about the Poliudi. Ola exacted a series of terrifying revenges that are legendary for their brutality and cleverness. But she wasn't just a fierce avenger, she was also a visionary. In the mid-10th century she travelled to Constantinople and was personally baptized, becoming the first ruler of Rus to embrace Christianity. This wasn't just a personal act, it was a profound political statement, signalling Rus's growing ties to the Byzantine world. Yet, despite Olha's conversion, paganism remained dominant in Rus for decades. Her grandson, Vladimir the Great, initially embraced paganism with fervour, even erecting new idols in Kyiv. But Volodymyr was a man of his time, a shrewd statesman who understood that a unified faith was essential for a unified state. The primary chronicle tells a fascinating, perhaps embellished story of Volodymyr sending envoys to observe the religions of his neighbours: Islam, Judaism, Western Christianity, and Eastern Orthodoxy. The envoys to Constantinople were reportedly so overwhelmed by the beauty and majesty of the Hagia Sophia and the Orthodox liturgy that they declared, "We knew not whether we were in heaven or on earth." This, my friends, was the turning point. In 988 CE, Volodymyr made the momentous decision to adopt Eastern Orthodox Christianity as the state religion of Kyivan Rus. He ordered the mass baptism of his people in the Dnipro River, tearing down pagan idols and replacing them with churches. This wasn't just a religious conversion, it was a cultural revolution. It brought Rus firmly into the sphere of Byzantine civilization, opening the floodgates to Byzantine art, architecture, literature, law, and education. It provided a common spiritual and ideological framework that helped bind the diverse Slavic tribes and Norse elite into a more cohesive entity. It was a declaration to the world. Rus was no longer a collection of pagan tribes, it was a Christian state, a player on the European stage. The period following Volodymyr's conversion, especially under his son Yaroslav the Wise, reigned 1019 to 1054, is often called the Golden Age of Kyivan Rus. Kiev blossomed into one of the largest and most magnificent cities in Europe, boasting splendid churches like the St. Sophia Cathedral, adorned with breathtaking mosaics and frescoes. Yaroslav codified the first East Slavic legal code, the Ruska Pravda, which, while harsh by modern standards, marked a significant step towards a more ordered society. He fostered literacy, established schools, and commissioned the translation of Greek texts. Kyiv became a centre of learning and culture, its libraries filled with precious manuscripts. Yaroslav's daughters married into the royal families of France, Hungary, and Norway, cementing Rus's place in the geopolitical landscape of medieval Europe. But even golden ages eventually dim. Kyivan Rus, despite its splendour, carried the seeds of its own fragmentation. The practice of udel, where the prince's lands were divided among his sons, led to constant internecine feuds and struggles for the throne of Kiev. The grand princes struggled to maintain control over the vast territories, especially as new nomadic threats emerged on the steppe. The Cumans, Polish-Lithuanians, who harassed the southern borders, disrupting trade routes and forcing populations northward. By the 12th century, the political unity of Kyivan Rus began to unravel. Power shifted away from Kiev to regional centres like Volodymyr Volynski in what is now western Ukraine and Suzdal in the north. The vibrant trade with Byzantium declined as the steep routes became too dangerous. The magnificent state that Oleg and Volodymyr had forged, a fusion of Norse vigour and Slavic resilience, a beacon of Orthodox Christianity, fractured into a collection of semi-independent principalities. Yet, the legacy of Kyivan Rus is indelible. It laid the foundational stones for what would become Ukrainian identity, language, and statehood. It established the cultural and religious framework that endures to this day. The churches, the legal codes, the chronicles, the very name, Rus, all speak to a powerful, complex, and formative period. It's a testament to how the land, this Jaik pole, continued to shape and be shaped by the forces that swept across it, forever adding new layers to its deep and captivating history. But the story doesn't end with fragmentation. Oh no, my friends, the challenges were only just beginning. Because looming at the horizon, a force unlike any seen before was gathering, a storm that would redefine the very map of Eurasia and push the Ukrainian lands into a new, terrifying and ultimately transformative era. So Kyivan Rus is fragmented, its strength divided. Its princes bicker, their strength sapped by internal feuds and the constant gnawing presence of the Cumans on the steppe. But the story of the Ukrainian lands, my friends, is never one of peace for long. Just when you think things can't get more complicated, history throws a curveball, or in this case, a thunderous horde from the east that will redefine everything. Imagine, if you will, the vast open expanse of the steppe, that colossal ribbon of prairie we've been talking about since the very beginning. For centuries, it served as a highway, a funnel for cultures, but also a gateway for invaders. And now, out of the distant horizon, a new terrifying storm gathers. This isn't just another nomadic tribe. This is something unprecedented. We're talking about the Mongols. From the heart of Asia, unified under the legendary Genghis Khan, these horsemen are an unstoppable force, a military machine unlike anything Europe has ever encountered. Their tactics are brutal, their discipline absolute, their reach seemingly limitless. They sweep across the continent with a speed that defies belief, leaving a trail of devastation in their wake. And by the early 13th century, they are knocking on the eastern gates of Rus. It's 1223. The princes of Rus, despite their squabbles, recognize the threat when a Mongol reconnaissance force, led by the brilliant generals Subutai and Jebe, appears on the steppe. The Cumans, their old adversaries, are now fleeing before this new power and appeal to their Rus neighbours for help. A strange alliance forms. Rus's princes, including Mstislav the Bold of Halych and Mstislav III of Kiev, gather their forces, perhaps 80,000 strong, and march south into the wild field, the Jaik Pole, to confront this unknown enemy. But here's the heartbreaking truth. They couldn't unite. Even facing an existential threat, the Rus princes act like a collection of individuals rather than a cohesive army. They argue, they disagree on strategy, and crucially, they don't trust each other. The Mongols, masters of deception and psychological warfare, exploit these divisions with chilling precision. They feign retreat, drawing the disorganized Rus's forces deeper into the steppe, stretching their lines, wearing them down. What follows is the devastating Battle of the Kalka River. On the banks of this seemingly innocuous river, the Rus forces are utterly annihilated. It's not just a defeat, it's a slaughter. Many princes are killed, some suffocated under a wooden platform where the Mongols hold their victory feast. This isn't just a military loss, it's a profound psychological blow. It shows the vulnerability of a fragmented Rus to a truly unified and ruthless enemy. The Mongols, after their victory, withdraw as suddenly as they appeared, leaving behind a land in shock, a chilling preview of the storm to come. The real hurricane hits a decade and a half later. In 1237, under the command of Batu Khan, a grandson of Genghis Khan, the main Mongol invasion begins. This time, there's no turning back. The sheer, brutal efficiency of it is chilling. City after city falls. Ryazan, Vladimir, Suzdal, all are sacked and burned. The Mongols use sophisticated siege engines, overwhelming defences with a relentless ferocity. Then, in 1240, they turn their gaze south, towards the heart of the former Kyivan Rus, Kiev itself. Kiev, the mother of Rus cities, once a beacon of medieval Europe, with its golden dome churches and bustling markets, is reduced to ashes. The descriptions from contemporary accounts are horrifying. There was nothing left but dead bodies and bones. The destruction is absolute. The population is massacred or enslaved. The glory of Kyivan Rus is extinguished, its political and cultural centre shattered. This isn't just the end of a state, It's the end of an era. The Mongol yoke, as it came to be known, casts a long dark shadow over the lands of Rus for the next 2.5 centuries. The Mongols establish a new political entity, the Golden Horde, headquartered on the lower Volga River. They don't directly rule most of the Rus lands, instead they impose a system of tribute. Rus's princes are forced to travel to the Horde, to kowtow before the Khan, to receive a Yarlik, a charter granting them permission to rule their own principalities, always under the watchful, demanding eye of their Mongol overlords. The impact is profound and multifaceted. It cuts off the Rus lands from Western Europe at a crucial period of development, fostering a distinct political and cultural trajectory. The economy is devastated, trade routes disrupted, and the population decimated. The wild field, the Jaikpol, becomes even wilder, a dangerous no-man's land patrolled by Mongol patrols and steppe nomads. But even in this darkest hour, life, resilience and resistance find a way, while the eastern and central Russ's lands fall squarely under the Golden Horde's sway. Some western principalities manage a precarious existence, caught between the Mongol threat and the rising powers of the West. This is where we see the emergence of Galicia-Volhynia, a principality that had been growing in strength and influence even before the Mongol invasion, situated in what is now western Ukraine. The towering figure of this period is Danilo Halitsky, or Daniel of Galicia. He's a fascinating character, a true survivor and a shrewd politician. Danilo understands the brutal realities of the time. He fights the Mongols when he can, but he also knows when to bend the knee. He travels to the Golden Horde, bows to the Khan, and accepts a Yarlik, all while actively seeking allies in the West. He even accepts a crown from the Pope in 1253, becoming the first and only King of Rus, hoping to secure military aid from Catholic Europe against the Mongols. Danilo's reign is a testament to the resilience of the Ukrainian spirit. He tries to rebuild his lands, encourages trade, and even establishes new cities like Lviv. He attempts to unite the disparate Rus' principalities to create a bulwark against the steppe. His kingdom, Galicia-Volhynia, becomes a beacon of Western orientation, absorbing Latin influences in administration, architecture, and even military organization. It's a desperate balancing act, a struggle to maintain identity and sovereignty in a world turned upside down. But the Golden Horde is too powerful, and Western aid is too little, too late. After Danilo's death, Galicia-Volhynia eventually succumbs to the pressures from both east and west. By the mid-14th century, its lands are absorbed by its powerful neighbours, Poland to the west and the rapidly expanding Grand Duchy of Lithuania to the north. This, my friends, is a pivotal moment in the shaping of the future Ukrainian identity. The fragmentation of Kyivan Rus and the subsequent Mongol invasion create a profound divergence. While the northeastern Rus lands, centered around Moscow, develop under a prolonged period of Mongol influence, gradually consolidating power and adopting a more autocratic model, the southwestern Rus lands, what we now call Ukraine, find themselves increasingly drawn into the orbit of Western European powers. The Grand Duchy of Lithuania, initially a pagan state, expands rapidly, absorbing vast swathes of former Rus' territory, including Kyiv itself, by the mid-14th century. The Lithuanians, remarkably, largely preserve the Ruthenian, Old Ukrainian Belarusian language and administrative practices, viewing themselves as heirs to the Kyivan Rus legacy. They even adopt Orthodox Christianity for a time, before the eventual union with Catholic Poland shifts their religious and cultural allegiance. Poland, for its part, takes control of Galicia, integrating it more directly into its Western European system. So, you see, the lands of Ukraine become a crucial borderland, a meeting point and often a battleground for different civilizations. The remnants of the Golden Horde to the east, the rising power of Muscovy to the northeast, and the expanding influence of Catholic Poland and pagan, then Catholic Lithuania to the west and north. This isn't just a political shift. It's a profound cultural and historical fork in the road. The distinct paths taken by these regions under different suzerainties contribute directly to the eventual differentiation of Ukrainian, Belarusian, and Russian identities. The centuries of Mongol rule, the rise of Lithuania and Poland, and the constant struggle for survival on the Jaik pole. The wild field forge a unique character in the lands and people who will eventually call themselves Ukrainians. The legacy of Kyivan Rus remains, a deep undercurrent of shared history and spiritual heritage, but the political landscape has been utterly transformed. Kiev lies in ruins, a shadow of its former glory. The centre of gravity has shifted. The stage is set for a new chapter, one where the lands of Ukraine find themselves increasingly drawn into the orbit of their western neighbours, a period that will bring both new opportunities and new forms of subjugation. The story of Ukraine, as a distinct entity, truly begins to take shape in these challenging, turbulent centuries. And believe me, the next chapter is just as epic as we explore how these diverse influences forge the very soul of a nation. Now, if you've been with me on this journey, you know the story of Ukraine is rarely a straightforward one. We left off with the lands of Kyivan Rus shattered by the Mongol onslaught, its western principalities, like Galicia-Volhynia, grappling with a new reality under the expanding influence of powerful neighbours. The grand unified vision of Kyivan Rus was gone, replaced by a patchwork of territories, each pulled in different directions. But here's the thing that always fascinates me. Even in the deepest fragmentation, new seeds of identity are sown. Imagine, if you will, the vast landscape once again, the immense forests to the north, the fertile forest steppe in the middle, and then, stretching to the horizon, the boundless Jaik pole, the wild field. It's still a land of immense natural wealth, but also a land that feels almost abandoned, a vacuum waiting to be filled, and fill it, powers did. While the Golden Horde held sway over the eastern parts, effectively cutting off development and communication with Western Europe, a new player was quietly yet rapidly expanding its reach from the northwest, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. Now, when we think of Lithuania today, we might think of a smaller Baltic nation, but in the 13th and 14th centuries this was a formidable force, a pagan state that surprisingly became a magnet for the fragmented Rus' lands. The Lithuanians, initially a pagan people, saw the opportunity in the power vacuum left by the Mongols. They weren't just conquering, they were often invited by Rus' princes who sought protection from the Golden Horde. And here's where it gets really interesting for our story. The Grand Duchy of Lithuania, under princes like Gediminas and Algirdas, absorbed vast swathes of former Kyivan Rus' territory, virtually all of modern-day Belarus, and much of what is now central and northern Ukraine, including Kiev itself, which fell to Algirdas in 1362. What's remarkable about this period, often called the quote 7, is the surprising degree of cultural and religious tolerance. Unlike the Mongols, the Lithuanians didn't impose their paganism. In fact, they gradually adopted Eastern Orthodoxy themselves, and Old East Slavic, the language of Kyivan Rus, became the official language of the Grand Duchy. Can you believe it? A powerful state, expanding rapidly, adopting the language and much of the legal framework of the people it absorbed. This wasn't just conquest, it was a complex cultural synthesis. Rus's nobility retained their rights, their faith, and their customs. For a time, it seemed like a continuation, albeit under new rulers, of the Kyivan Rus's legacy, just shifted north and west. But history, as we know, rarely stands still. The Grand Duchy of Lithuania, though powerful, found itself under increasing pressure from the Teutonic Knights to the west, and the rising power of Muscovy to the east. To counter these threats, Lithuania turned to its other powerful neighbour, the Kingdom of Poland. And this, my friends, is where the path of the future Ukrainian people truly begins to diverge irrevocably. In 1385, the Union of Krylo was signed. This wasn't just a political alliance, it was a dynastic union. Grand Duke Jogaila of Lithuania married Queen Hadwiga of Poland, converting to Catholicism and becoming King of Poland. This act and the subsequent unions, most notably the Union of Lublin in 1569, profoundly reshaped the political and cultural landscape of Eastern Europe. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was born, a colossal, multi-ethnic, multi-religious state that, at its peak, was one of the largest and most powerful in Europe. For the lands of Ukraine, this meant a significant shift. While Lithuania had been relatively tolerant, Poland was overwhelmingly Catholic and had a deeply entrenched feudal system. With the Union of Lublin, most of the Ukrainian territories, including Kyiv, Volhynia, and Podylia, were transferred directly from the Grand Duchy of Lithuania to the crown of the Kingdom of Poland. This wasn't just an administrative change, it was a cultural and social earthquake. Suddenly, the Rus nobility, who had enjoyed significant autonomy under Lithuania, found themselves under pressure to convert to Catholicism and adopt Polish language and customs if they wanted to retain their status and influence within the new Commonwealth. Many did, becoming Polonized szlachta, nobility, often at the expense of their own people and heritage. This created a deep social chasm, a largely Polonized Catholic nobility ruling over an overwhelmingly Orthodox, Rus's, proto-Ukrainian peasantry. And what about that peasantry? This is where the story turns darker. Under Polish rule, the system of serfdom became increasingly entrenched and brutal. The fertile lands of Ukraine, the famed breadbasket of Europe, became prime targets for large Polish magnates who sought to establish vast latifundia, large estates, to produce grain for sale to Western Europe. Peasants were tied to the land, their freedoms curtailed, their labour exploited. They were in essence commodities. This economic exploitation, coupled with religious and cultural pressure, created a simmering cauldron of discontent. But remember the Jake Pole? That wild, untamed frontier? It wasn't just a place of exploitation, it was also a place of escape, a haven for the desperate and the daring. And it was here, in the vastness of the steppe, that a new force was forged, one that would come to define Ukrainian identity for centuries, the Cossacks. The word, and quote, itself comes from the Turkic word Cossack, meaning a, quote, 10, or quote, 10, And that's exactly what they were. Imagine the scene. Runaway serfs fleeing the Polish magnates, adventurers seeking fortune, Orthodox believers escaping Catholic pressure, even impoverished nobility looking for a new life. They gravitated towards the southern frontier, the borderland with the Crimean Khanate, a successor state to the Golden Horde, and the Ottoman Empire. This was a dangerous, volatile zone constantly raided by Tatar horsemen, but it was also a place of freedom, where the writ of the Polish king ran thin. These weren't just random bands. They quickly organized themselves into a formidable military force. They built fortified settlements, most famously the Zaporizhzhian Sich, a legendary island fortress on the Dnipro River. The Sich wasn't just a military camp, it was a unique democratic society. Cossacks elected their leaders, the hetman and other starshina officers, and made decisions collectively. Their life was one of constant vigilance, raiding and defending. They were masters of guerrilla warfare, skilled horsemen and expert marksmen. They were, in essence, the self-appointed guardians of the steppe, protecting the Orthodox population from Tatar raids, but also increasingly challenging the authority of the Polish Commonwealth. The Polish crown initially saw the Cossacks as a useful buffer force against the Tatars and Ottomans, enlisting some of them into, quote, 12 regiments. But the wild, independent spirit of the Cossacks, their Orthodox faith, and their growing numbers made them an increasingly unruly and dangerous element from the perspective of the Commonwealth. They were a force born of the very tensions that Polish rule had exacerbated: social injustice, religious oppression, incest, and the yearning for freedom in the untamed expanses of the steppe. As the 16th century drew to a close, the religious tensions within the Commonwealth reached a boiling point. The Catholic Church, backed by the Polish crown, sought to bring the Orthodox population under its fold. This led to a momentous event in 1596, the Union of Brest. Here's how it worked. A significant portion of the Orthodox hierarchy in the Ukrainian and Belarusian lands agreed to unite with the Roman Catholic Church, acknowledging the Pope as their spiritual head, but retaining their Eastern rites, liturgy, and married clergy. This created what we now call the Greek Catholic Church, or Uniate Church. The Union of Brest was meant to resolve religious divisions, but it did the opposite. It created a deep schism within Ukrainian society. Some embraced it as a way to bridge the gap between East and West, to gain the protection of the Polish state while preserving their cultural distinctiveness. Others saw it as a betrayal of orthodoxy, a forced conversion, and a further erosion of their identity. The Cossacks, fiercely orthodox, became ardent defenders of the Eastern faith, seeing themselves as the protectors of the, quote, 13, quote, against both Catholic and Muslim encroachment. So, by the dawn of the 17th century, the lands of Ukraine were a true crucible. They were a borderland caught between the powerful Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth to the west, the Ottoman Empire and its Crimean Tatar vassals to the south, and the growing Muscovite state to the east. Within this crucible, the distinct Ukrainian identity was being forged, shaped by the contrasting forces of Polish feudalism and Catholicization, Lithuanian Rus tolerance, and the fierce, independent spirit of the Cossacks. The Ukrainian language, evolving from Old East Slavic, was taking shape, distinct from both Polish and Muscovite Russian. The Orthodox faith, despite the challenge of the Union of Brest, remained a powerful marker of identity. and the Cossacks, with their tales of heroism, their democratic ideals and their defiant spirit, were becoming the embodiment of the Ukrainian struggle for freedom and self-determination. They were not just a military force, they were a social phenomenon, a cultural symbol, a political actor, and a nascent national consciousness. This wasn't just a story of subjugation, it was a story of resilience, adaptation, and the birth of a unique identity forged in the fires of conflict. The wild field, the Jaik Pole, had given birth to a people who would fight for their freedom with an intensity that would shake empires. And that, my friends, is where our next chapter truly begins, with the dramatic uprisings of the Cossacks, the tumultuous century that followed, and the relentless struggle for a place in the sun. Get ready for a period of epic battles, shifting alliances, and the ultimate test of the Ukrainian spirit. The stage, my friends, is set. Imagine the Jaik Pole, that wild, untamed frontier, not just as a physical space, but as a crucible of human spirit, constantly simmering with the promise of freedom and the threat of oppression. By the early 17th century, the pressure cooker that was the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth's rule over Ukrainian lands had reached its boiling point. The twin forces of serfdom and Polonization, coupled with the religious schism of the Union of Brest, created an unbearable tension. The Orthodox peasantry, the burgeoning Cossack class, and even some Orthodox nobility found themselves increasingly alienated, their rights trampled, their faith threatened. And who rises to meet this challenge? The Cossacks, of course. These free men, these guardians of the steppe, who had forged a unique democratic military society in the Zaporizhzhian Sich, were not just raiders or border guards anymore. They were becoming the embodiment of a nascent national consciousness, a collective desire for self-determination. They yearned for more than just freedom from serfdom. They yearned for a state, a homeland where their orthodox faith and their distinct culture could thrive. The first decades of the 17th century are marked by a series of Cossack uprisings, each one a fiery protest against the Commonwealth's policies. Leaders like Petro Konashevich Sahaydachny, Taras Fedorovich, Taras Triasilo, and Ivan Sulima led significant rebellions, often attracting thousands of peasants and townspeople to their banners. These weren't isolated skirmishes, they were large-scale insurrections, brutal and bloody, shaking the very foundations of the Commonwealth. While often brutally suppressed, they served as vital training grounds, forging a collective memory of resistance and refining Cossack military tactics. They were also a stark warning, largely unheeded by the Polish szlachta nobility, that the Jaik Pole would not be tamed. But these earlier uprisings, for all their ferocity, lacked one crucial element: a unifying figure with the strategic genius and political acumen to transform rebellion into state-building. That figure, my friends, emerges from the very heart of the Cossack experience: Bohdan Khmelnytsky. Born into the Cossack gentry, Khmelnytsky was no ordinary warrior. He was educated, multilingual, and a veteran of countless campaigns against the Tatars and Turks. He understood the intricacies of diplomacy as well as the brutality of battle, but it was a deeply personal injustice that truly ignited the powder keg. In 1647, a Polish nobleman, Daniel Czaplinski, seized Khmelnytsky's estate, murdered his son, and abducted his fiancée. When Khmelnytsky sought justice in the Commonwealth courts, he was denied. This wasn't just a personal slight, It was a glaring symbol of the systemic injustice faced by all Ukrainians under Polish rule. Furious and disillusioned, Khmelnytsky fled to the Zaporizhzhian Sich in early 1648. There, he rallied the Cossacks, channeling their accumulated grievances and their burning desire for freedom into a singular monumental uprising. This wasn't just another rebellion. This was the Khmelnytsky Uprising, an event that would irrevocably alter the course of Ukrainian history. What blows my mind about this moment is the sheer audacity and scale of Khmelnytsky's vision. He wasn't just fighting for better terms, he was fighting for a Cossack state. He forged a critical, if often unreliable, alliance with the Crimean Tatars, whose formidable cavalry provided a crucial advantage against the Polish-winged hussars. With this alliance, Khmelnytsky launched a lightning campaign that stunned Europe. Imagine the scene: a sea of Cossack warriors, armed with pikes, sabres and muskets, joined by thousands upon thousands of enraged peasants, marching across the steppe. The initial victories at Zhovty Vody and Korsun were devastating for the Commonwealth forces. Polish armies were annihilated, their commanders captured. The rebellion spread like wildfire, engulfing the entire Dnieper Ukraine. Peasants, driven by centuries of oppression, rose up with terrifying ferocity, targeting Polish nobles, Jewish leaseholders, and Catholic priests. It was a brutal, chaotic explosion of pent-up rage, a social revolution intertwined with a national liberation movement. By the end of 1648, Khmelnytsky's forces controlled vast swathes of territory, and he made a triumphant entry into Kyiv, where he was hailed as a liberator, a new Moses leading his people to freedom. The Patriarch of Jerusalem, Paisios, who was visiting Kyiv at the time, recognized Khmelnytsky as the, quote, 15, anointing him as a national leader. This wasn't just a military victory, it was a profound psychological shift. The Cossacks, led by Khmelnytsky, were no longer just a band of freemen. They were seen, and began to see themselves, as the nucleus of a burgeoning nation. This is the birth of the Cossack Hetmanate, a de facto independent state, albeit one constantly struggling for international recognition and facing relentless external threats. Khmelnytsky, now the hetman, became its military, administrative and diplomatic head. He established a sophisticated system of governance, dividing the territory into regiments, polki, and companies, sotny, each with its own Cossack administration. Kyiv once again became a vibrant centre of Orthodox learning and culture, now under Cossack protection. But the struggle was far from over. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, though reeling, was still a formidable power. Khmelnytsky knew he couldn't stand alone. His alliance with the Tatars was always precarious, driven by plunder rather than shared destiny. The Tatars often turned on their allies, seizing captives to sell into slavery, even raiding Ukrainian villages. Khmelnytsky was caught in a brutal geopolitical trap, constantly seeking stable allies in a region defined by shifting loyalties. He looked west to the Ottoman Empire and even considered an alliance with Sweden. But the most significant and ultimately tragic turn was his increasing reliance on Muscovy, the burgeoning Russian state to the northeast. Muscovy shared the Orthodox faith with the Ukrainians, and Khmelnytsky initially saw them as natural protectors against Catholic Poland. He appealed to Tsar Alexei I for military assistance and protection, hoping to secure his nascent state's sovereignty. Here's where we arrive at one of the most contentious and pivotal moments in Ukrainian history. The Treaty of Pereyaslav in January 1654. After years of negotiation, war and Tatar betrayals, Khmelnytsky and a Cossack council gathered in the city of Pereyaslav to swear allegiance to the Muscovite Tsar. Now, this isn't just a simple treaty, my friends. It's a chasm of misunderstanding and conflicting interpretations that continues to haunt Ukrainian-Russian relations to this very day. From Khmelnytsky's perspective and that of the Cossack elite, Pereyaslav was a military alliance, a protectorate agreement. They believed they were entering into a temporary union with the Tsar, maintaining their internal autonomy, their Cossack liberties, and their hetmanate's distinct governance. They saw the Tsar as a fellow Orthodox monarch offering protection, not as an absolute sovereign absorbing their lands. They expected Muscovy to protect them from Poland, while they, the Cossacks, would continue to govern their own affairs. But from the Muscovite perspective, it was something entirely different. The Tsar's envoys viewed Pereyaslav as an act of submission, a reincorporation of Little Rus, as they called Ukraine, into the Muscovite realm. They saw Khmelnytsky's oath as permanent, binding and absolute. They interpreted, quote, 18, quote, as direct sovereignty, and, quote, 19, quote, as temporary concessions that could be revoked at will. They immediately began to send Muscovite governors and garrisons into Ukrainian cities, a clear sign of their intent. The differences were stark, fundamental, and irreconcilable. The Cossacks, who had just fought so fiercely for their freedom, found themselves exchanging one overlord for another, one set of pressures for a new, insidious kind of control. The immediate consequences were devastating. The Treaty of Pereyaslav did not bring peace. It ignited a new, even more protracted and brutal conflict. The Russo-Polish War fought largely on Ukrainian soil. Poland naturally did not accept Muscovy's claims, and the Ukrainian lands became the main battleground for these two great powers. Khmelnytsky himself quickly realized the gravity of his miscalculation. He saw Muscovite interference growing, their promises unfulfilled, their intentions clear. He tried to pivot, seeking new alliances with Sweden and Transylvania, but his health was failing. He died in 1657, leaving behind a hetmanate that was nominally under Muscovite protection but internally fractured and externally besieged. And with his death, Ukraine descends into a period so chaotic, so devastating, that it earned the name Ruina, the ruin. This isn't just a chapter, it's a maelstrom. It's a time of civil war, constant foreign intervention, and the tragic splintering of the Cossack state, where allegiances shift like the steppe winds, and the promise of freedom seems to recede further and further into the horizon. The flame of freedom ignited by Khmelnytsky at Pereyaslav casts a long, flickering shadow, one that will define the destiny of Ukraine for centuries to come. And that, my friends, is where our next journey into the heart of Ukrainian history truly begins. And so, my friends, the ink on the Treaty of Pereyaslav was barely dry when the Ruina, quote 21, descended upon Ukraine. Imagine, if you will, the ground still trembling from Khmelnytsky's war, the air thick with the promise of independence, only for it all to dissolve into a terrifying maelstrom of civil war, foreign intervention, and the brutal splintering of a nascent state. This wasn't just a period of hardship. It was a 3-decade-long nightmare, from 1657 to 1687, that carved deep, lasting scars into the Ukrainian soul and landscape. It's a truly heartbreaking chapter because it shows us a people, a nation, caught between monumental forces, desperate for self-determination but ultimately unable to secure it. After Khmelnytsky's death, the Cossack hetmanate, a state he had so painstakingly forged, became a prize, a pawn in a deadly game played by powerful empires. Think of Ukraine during these years as a ship in a furious storm, with multiple captains vying for the helm and the very hull being torn apart by the waves. Successive hetmans, each a formidable figure in their own right, rose and fell with dizzying speed, each attempting to navigate the impossible currents. There was Ivan Verkhovsky, who tried to pivot back towards the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth with the Treaty of Hadiach, aiming for a Ruthenian Grand Duchy, on equal footing with Poland and Lithuania. A bold vision, absolutely, but one that was ultimately torpedoed by internal Cossack dissent, Russian opposition, and Polish reluctance. Then came Petro Doroshenko, a hetman known as the Son of Ruin, for his relentless, yet ultimately tragic struggle. He attempted to unify the fragmented hetmanate and, in a desperate bid for sovereignty, even allied with the Ottoman Empire and the Crimean Tatars. Can you imagine the sheer courage, or perhaps desperation, to try and leverage one powerful empire against another, all to carve out a space for your own people? But these alliances were double-edged swords, often leading to more devastation for the Ukrainian populace caught in the middle. The Dnieper River, which we've seen as a lifeblood, now became a gaping wound, a stark dividing line. On one side, the left bank hetmanate, east of the Dnieper, increasingly fell under Muscovite influence. On the other, the right bank hetmanate, west of the Dnieper, remained a battleground, constantly contested by Poland, the Ottomans, and the Tatars. This isn't just geography, it's a profound cultural and political schism that reverberated for centuries. The great powers, seeing Ukraine's internal turmoil, didn't hesitate to exploit it. The Russo-Polish War, which had erupted partly due to Pereyaslav, raged across Ukrainian lands. The devastation was unimaginable. Villages were razed, populations decimated, and the very fabric of society was torn apart. It's a period where the term Dzik Pol takes on an even more brutal meaning. A wild field, yes, but now wild with the blood of its own people and the boots of foreign armies. Finally, in 1667, after years of brutal conflict, then Muscovy and Poland signed the Treaty of Andrusovo. Here's the punch to the gut. Ukraine, the very land they were fighting over, wasn't even at the negotiating table. This treaty formally divided the hetmanate along the Dnieper River. Left bank Ukraine, along with Kyiv, was ceded to Muscovy. Right bank Ukraine, with some exceptions, remained under Polish control. Then, in 1686, this division was cemented by the Eternal Peace Treaty. Imagine the feeling of being partitioned, your homeland literally sliced in two, by powers who saw you as little more than territory. The dream of a unified, independent Cossack state seemed to vanish, replaced by a grim reality of fractured autonomy and foreign domination. But even within this fragmentation, the spirit of the Cossacks, and indeed the Ukrainian people, continued to flicker. Let's turn our gaze to the left bank hetmanate, now under the watchful and increasingly possessive eye of Muscovy. While the hetmanate retained a semblance of autonomy, with its own elected hetman, Cossack administration, and legal system, Moscow's grip steadily tightened. It was a slow, deliberate erosion, like water wearing away stone. Muscovite garrisons were established. Russian officials began to interfere in internal affairs, and the economic ties increasingly favoured Moscow. The Cossack freedoms, so dearly won, began to feel less like rights and more like privileges that could be revoked at any moment. It's in this environment that we encounter one of the most complex and ultimately tragic figures in Ukrainian history, Hetman Ivan Mazepa. Mazepa, who became hetman in 1687, was a man of immense intellect, culture, and political acumen. He understood the shifting power dynamics of Eastern Europe better than most. For over 2 decades, he skillfully navigated the treacherous waters of Muscovite politics, earning the trust of Tsar Peter the Great. He was a patron of arts and education, fostering a cultural renaissance in the Hetmanate, building churches and supporting the Kyiv Mohyla Academy. He seemed for a time to embody the hope of preserving Ukrainian autonomy within the Muscovite orbit. He played the long game, consolidating power and trying to protect the Hetmanate from Peter's increasingly centralizing tendencies. But Peter the Great was not just any Tsar. He was a transformative, often brutal force who was determined to modernize and expand the Russian Empire, making it a dominant European power. And Ukraine, with its fertile lands and strategic location, was central to his ambitions. Peter saw the Hetmanate not as an ally, but as a stepping stone, a resource to be exploited, and its autonomy as an inconvenient obstacle. The stage for Mazepa's ultimate gamble was set by the Great Northern War, 1700 to 1721, a titanic struggle between Sweden, led by the brilliant but audacious King Charles XII, and the rising Russian Empire under Peter. This war was a game-changer for all of Eastern Europe. As Peter began to demand more and more from the Hetmanate, soldiers, resources, labour for his ambitious construction projects like St. Petersburg, Mazepa saw the writing on the wall. He realized that Peter's vision for Russia left no room for a truly autonomous Ukraine. The Cossack liberties, the very essence of their identity, were being systematically dismantled. So, in 1708, Mazepa made his fateful decision. He secretly allied with Charles XII of Sweden, believing that a Swedish victory offered the last best hope for Ukrainian independence. It was an audacious, incredibly risky move, a high-stakes poker game for the future of his nation. He rallied some of the Cossacks, including the Zaporizhzhians, to his cause, promising a free Ukraine under Swedish protection. The response from Peter the Great was swift, brutal, and absolute. He declared Mazepa a traitor, excommunicated him from the Orthodox Church, a powerful blow in that era, and unleashed his forces on the Hetmanate. The city of Baturin, the Hetmanate's capital, was sacked with horrific savagery in November 1708. Thousands were massacred, including women and children, a chilling warning to anyone who dared to defy the Tsar. This wasn't just punishment. It was a deliberate act of terror, meant to crush any future aspirations for Ukrainian autonomy. The climax came in June 1709 at the Battle of Poltava. Here, on Ukrainian soil, the fate of empires and nations was decided. Charles XII and Mazepa, with their combined forces, faced Peter the Great's modernized Russian army. The battle was a decisive victory for Peter. Charles XII was wounded, and his army was utterly defeated. Mazepa, his dreams shattered, fled with Charles XII to Ottoman territory, where he died shortly after, a broken man. Poltava was more than just a military defeat. It was a catastrophe for Ukrainian statehood. Peter the Great wasted no time in systematically dismantling the remnants of Cossack autonomy. He replaced Mazepa with a loyalist hetman, Kyivan Rus, but ensured that this new hetman's power was severely curtailed. Russian officials known as the Little Russian Collegium were appointed to oversee the hetmanate, effectively stripping away its administrative independence. The election of hetmans became a mere formality, requiring imperial approval. Cossack regiments were increasingly integrated into the Russian army, losing their distinct character. Meanwhile, on the right bank, under Polish rule, the situation was no less grim. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, weakened by internal strife and external wars, was itself in decline. But for the Ukrainian population there, it meant continued serfdom, Polonization of the nobility, and religious pressure from the Catholic Church. The dream of a unified Cossack state remained just that, a dream constantly out of reach. The systematic annihilation of Ukrainian autonomy continued relentlessly throughout the 18th century, especially under Catherine the Great, who was determined to complete Peter's work of centralizing imperial power. In 1764, the hetmanate was formally abolished, and the last hetman, Kyrylo Rozumovsky, was forced to resign. The lands of the hetmanate were fully absorbed into the Russian Empire, becoming part of the Little Russia Governorate. And then, the final symbolic blow. In 1775, Catherine the Great ordered the complete destruction of the Zaporizhzhian Sich. The legendary Cossack stronghold, the beating heart of Ukrainian liberty and self-governance for centuries, was razed to the ground. Its treasury was seized, its cannon melted down, and its Cossacks dispersed, many fleeing to Ottoman lands or being integrated into Russian military units. The Jaik Pole, once the refuge and birthplace of the Cossack spirit, was now fully tamed, ploughed under by the imperial machine. But the story of Ukraine's fragmentation wasn't quite over. As the 18th century drew to a close, another major geopolitical shift occurred: the partitions of Poland. The ailing Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, weakened by internal dysfunction and external pressure, was systematically carved up by its powerful neighbours, Russia, Prussia and Austria, in three stages: 1772, 1793 and 1795. For Ukraine, this meant that the vast majority of its historical territories, including most of the right bank lands that had remained under Polish control, now fell under the direct rule of the Russian Empire. Only Galicia, a significant western Ukrainian region, was incorporated into the Austrian Habsburg Empire. So, by the end of the 18th century, the landscape of Ukraine had been utterly transformed. The Cossack hetmanate was gone. The Zaporizhzhian Sich was a memory. The dream of an independent, unified Ukraine had been crushed beneath the heel of two powerful empires. Ukraine was no longer a nascent state struggling for its own path. It was a divided land, its people subjects of distant monarchs, its language and culture often suppressed. This, my friends, marks the end of an era, the end of the Cossack age of independent state-building. But as we've seen throughout this journey, the story of Ukraine is one of resilience. Even under imperial rule, the seeds of a distinct national identity, nurtured through centuries of struggle, were not dead. They were simply waiting for the right moment to sprout again, in new forms under new circumstances, And that, my friends, is where our next chapter truly begins, the age of empires and the long, arduous journey of national awakening. The 18th century closed with the Ukrainian lands fragmented, their nascent statehood crushed, and their people divided under the iron heels of two colossal empires, the Russian and the Austrian Habsburgs. It's a moment in our story that feels like a deep, collective sigh, a forced quiet after centuries of furious, hopeful struggle. You might think, looking at the map, that this was the end of the Ukrainian narrative, just another footnote in the grand imperial sagas. But if you've been with me this far, you know that's not how it works with this tenacious land and its resilient people. No, this wasn't an end. It was a crucible of a different sort. The 19th century, often called the Long Sleep for many oppressed nations, was, for Ukrainians, a period of profound internal transformation. The dream of statehood might have been forcibly put to rest, but the seeds of a unified national identity were quietly, stubbornly germinating beneath the surface of imperial rule. It's a paradox, isn't it? The more an empire tries to erase a people, the more fiercely that people clings to what makes them unique. So let's peel back the layers of the 19th century, seeing how two distinct imperial experiences shaped a single emerging Ukrainian identity. First, let's turn our gaze eastward, to the vast stretches of left bank Ukraine and much of right bank Ukraine, now firmly under the suffocating embrace of the Russian Empire. Here, the imperial policy was clear and brutal: Russification. The very idea of a distinct Ukrainian nation was to be systematically dismantled. The language, which had been the vibrant tongue of the Cossack hetmanate, was reduced to a quaint rural patois fit only for folk songs and peasant chatter, certainly not for literature, administration, or education. Imagine a world where your language is actively discouraged, mocked, even forbidden in public life. Schools, courts, churches, all became instruments of Russification. Even the Orthodox Church, once a bulwark of Ukrainian identity, was subsumed under the Russian Holy Synod, losing its distinct Ukrainian character. The Ukrainian nobility, the descendants of Cossack officers and gentry, were either Russified, adopting Russian language and culture to preserve their status, or they found themselves marginalized. And the vast majority of Ukrainians, they were peasants, living in an agrarian society, many still bound by the chains of serfdom. Think about that for a moment. For centuries, the Yedzhik Pole had offered a promise of freedom, a escape from bondage. Now, under the Russian Empire, that freedom was an illusion for millions. They toiled on the lands of Russian landlords, their lives dictated by the whims of their masters, their voices unheard, their aspirations confined to the struggle for daily survival. This wasn't just economic hardship, it was a spiritual weight, a constant reminder of their subjugation. But here's the thing about a people's spirit: it's incredibly hard to extinguish. Even under this relentless pressure, Ukrainian culture persisted in the villages, in the folk tales, the songs, the embroidery, the family traditions. The language, though suppressed, lived on the lips of the people, passed down from generation to generation around hearthfires, and then a spark. In the early 19th century, a new generation of educated Ukrainians, often from the lower gentry or clergy, began to look at their heritage with fresh eyes. They were often educated in Russian universities, yet they felt a pull towards their roots. They started collecting folk songs, writing grammars of the Little Russian dialect, and documenting the rich history of the Cossacks. This was the beginning of the Ukrainian intelligentsia, a small but growing group who dared to believe that their dialect was a language and their region a nation. And at the heart of this awakening stands one figure, towering above all others, Taras Shevchenko. Born a serf in 1814, his life story is a microcosm of the Ukrainian struggle and defiance. He was a poet, a painter, a revolutionary, and a prophet. Imagine a man who, despite being enslaved, possessed such immense talent that he was eventually bought out of serfdom by sympathetic artists. He went on to become a celebrated artist, but it was his poetry, written in the Ukrainian language, that truly ignited the national spirit. Shevchenko's magnum opus, Kobzar, published in 1840, was a thunderclap. It wasn't just poetry, it was a defiant cry for freedom, a lament for lost glory, and a powerful assertion of Ukrainian identity. He wrote about the Cossacks, the Dnieper, the suffering of his people, and he did it in a language that the common people understood, elevating it from a peasant tongue to a literary vehicle capable of expressing the deepest human emotions and the most profound national aspirations. He didn't just write in Ukrainian, he wrote for Ukraine. This wasn't a quote 32 poet. This was the Ukrainian poet. His words were so potent, so challenging to the imperial narrative, that he was eventually arrested, exiled, and forbidden to write or paint for 10 years. But by then the fire was lit. His words had seeped into the very soul of the nation. Following in the wake of this cultural awakening, a more explicit political consciousness began to emerge. In the mid-1840s, a secret society formed in Kyiv, the Brotherhood of Saints, Cyril and Methodius. Composed of intellectuals like Mykola Kostomarov, Panteleimon Kulish, and even Shevchenko himself, they dreamed of a pan-Slavic federation where Ukraine would be an equal independent member, free from Russian imperial domination and serfdom. Their ideals were radical for their time, advocating for social justice, education, and the abolition of serfdom alongside national self-determination. Of course, the Tsar's secret police swiftly uncovered and suppressed the Brotherhood, sending its members to exile or imprisonment. But the very existence of such a group, with such clear national and political goals, demonstrates the growing intensity of Ukrainian aspirations. Then came a pivotal moment that reshaped the social landscape, the abolition of serfdom in 1861 by Tsar Alexander II. On the surface, it was a massive step towards freedom. Millions of Ukrainian serfs were emancipated, but the reality was often complex and harsh. Many were freed without land or with insufficient land, leading to new forms of economic dependency and poverty. Yet this seismic shift also had unintended consequences for national identity. Freed peasants, no longer tied to the land in the same way, became more mobile, more receptive to new ideas, and more likely to identify with the broader community than just their village. The imperial response to this burgeoning Ukrainian identity was to double down on suppression. The Valiev Circular of 1863 declared that, quote, 33. Then came the even more draconian M's Ukaz of 1876, which outright banned the publication of books in Ukrainian, the importation of Ukrainian texts, public performances, and even the teaching of Ukrainian in schools. Imagine that, a complete erasure of public life for a language spoken by millions. This wasn't just about control, it was an attempt at cultural genocide. But what happens when you try to crush a spirit that deeply? It finds new ways to breathe. Ukrainian activists went underground, publishing abroad in places like Geneva or, crucially, in the other half of the divided Ukrainian lands, Galicia. Now let's shift our gaze westward, to the lands of Galicia, Bukovina, and Transcarpathia, which found themselves under the rule of the Austrian Habsburg Empire. Here, the story takes a different, though no less complex, turn. While still an empire, the Habsburgs were, by the 19th century, a multi-ethnic patchwork trying to manage diverse populations. Their approach, often one of, quote, 34, inadvertently created more space for national development compared to the Russian Empire's monolithic Russification. For Ukrainians in Galicia, who were often referred to as Ruthenians by the Austrians, the Greek Catholic Church became an indispensable anchor of national identity. Remember the Union of Brest in 1596. This church, which maintained Orthodox rites but acknowledged the Pope, had been a source of division in the past, but under Austrian rule, especially after the reforms of Empress Maria Theresa and Joseph II, it became the national institution. Its priests, educated in seminaries that maintained the Ukrainian language, were not only spiritual leaders but often the intellectual and political leaders of their communities. They were the ones preserving the language, establishing reading rooms, and fostering a sense of distinct identity. This environment, though far from perfect, allowed for an earlier and more open national awakening. In the 1830s, a group of young intellectuals known as the Ruska Tritsia, Ruthenian Trinity, Markian Shashkevich, Ivan Vahilevich, and Yakiv Holovatsky, began to publish works in the vernacular Ukrainian language, collecting folk songs and stories. Their almanac, Rusalka Dnistrovaya, the Dniester Mermaid, published in Buda in 1837 because of censorship at home, was a groundbreaking moment, asserting the literary potential of the language. As the century progressed, Galicia became what historians often call the Piedmont of the Ukrainian national revival, just as the small Italian state of Piedmont led the unification of Italy. Galicia, though small and under imperial rule, became a beacon. Here, Ukrainian political parties emerged, gaining representation in the Austrian parliament and provincial diets. Cultural institutions like the Prosvita societies, which promoted literacy and Ukrainian culture, and the prestigious Shevchenko Scientific Society were established. These were crucial platforms for developing a national consciousness, publishing books, and nurturing scholarship in Ukrainian. This relative freedom created a magnet effect. Ukrainian activists, writers, and scholars fleeing the brutal suppression of the Russian Empire found refuge and a publishing outlet in Galicia. Figures like Mikhailo Hrushevsky, who would become the preeminent historian of Ukraine, moved to Lviv, Lemberg to work more freely. This constant cross-pollination of ideas, despite the imperial border, was vital. It ensured that the concept of a unified Ukrainian nation spanning both empires continued to evolve. So, here we are at the close of the 19th century. On one side, a people whose language and culture were systematically crushed, yet who produced a literary giant like Shevchenko, and a burgeoning, if underground, political movement. On the other, a people who, under a different imperial hand, found institutional ways to preserve and develop their national identity, creating a Piedmont for the entire nation. Despite the deep divisions imposed by empires, a shared sense of Ukraine was slowly, inexorably taking root. It was born from the common language, the shared memory of Cossack glory, the folk traditions, and the powerful words of poets and intellectuals who dared to dream of a united, free nation. The concept of a modern Ukrainian identity, distinct from Little Russian or Ruthenian, was solidifying. The 19th century was a period of forced dormancy, a time when the Ukrainian spirit was tested, refined, and forged anew in the fires of imperial oppression and cultural awakening. But as the new century dawned, the great empires that had carved up Ukraine were themselves beginning to show cracks, and the seeds of national consciousness, so carefully nurtured in the long night of the 19th century, were about to burst forth with an unprecedented urgency. The stage was being set for a dramatic and often tragic push for independence that would define the early 20th century. If you remember, we left Ukraine at the close of the 19th century, a land of simmering national consciousness, divided between two vast empires, the Russian and the Austro-Hungarian. In Galicia, under Habsburg rule, the Ukrainian spirit found a precious, if precarious, space to breathe and grow, becoming a Piedmont for the nation. But in the Russian Empire, the suppression was brutal, the language forbidden, the very idea of a separate Ukrainian identity a dangerous heresy. Yet the seeds of nationhood, sown by Shevchenko and nurtured by countless intellectuals, were taking root, deep in the fertile soil of the Ukrainian soul. Now imagine the world holding its breath, poised on the edge of a precipice. The first decade of the 20th century was a period of tense quiet, a prelude to a storm unlike any humanity had ever witnessed. And Ukraine, as always, found itself directly in the eye of that coming tempest. In 1914, the Great War, what we now call World War I, exploded across Europe. This wasn't just another conflict. It was a cataclysm that would tear apart empires, redraw maps, and fundamentally reshape the course of history. For Ukrainians, it was a particularly cruel twist of fate. Think about it. Our people, divided by imperial borders, were forced to fight each other. Ukrainians from the Russian Empire were conscripted into the Tsar's army, sent to the front lines against their brethren from Galicia and Bukovina, who wore the uniforms of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Can you imagine the heartbreak, the impossible choices, the sheer tragedy of a nation literally at war with itself, manipulated by powers that denied its very existence? The vast plains of Ukraine, once again, became a colossal battlefield. The Eastern Front, a brutal, shifting line, often ran right through Ukrainian villages and fields. Millions of lives were lost, infrastructure was shattered, and the land was scarred by trenches and artillery. But amidst this devastation, a paradox emerged. The war, while horrific, also weakened the very empires that had held Ukraine captive for centuries. The foundations of both the Russian and Austro-Hungarian empires began to crack under the immense pressure of total war. Here's where it gets truly fascinating and heartbreaking, all at once. The year 1917 arrived, a year that would shake the world and for a brief blazing moment offer Ukraine a chance to seize its destiny. In March, the Russian Empire, exhausted and broken by war and internal strife, imploded. The Tsar abdicated, and the centuries-old autocracy crumbled, replaced by a provisional government. For Ukrainians, this was a monumental opening. Almost immediately in Kyiv, the Central Rada Council was formed. This wasn't just a spontaneous uprising, it was the culmination of decades of intellectual and political work by figures like Mikhailo Hrushevsky, a towering historian who became its head, and Volodymyr Vinnychenko, a prominent writer and political leader. Initially, the Central Rada sought autonomy within a democratic Russian Federation. They weren't immediately pushing for full independence. Understanding the immense challenges, they wanted to build, to consolidate, to gain recognition. But history, as we know, rarely unfolds according to a carefully laid plan. In October 1917, a second, more radical revolution swept through Russia. The Bolsheviks, led by Lenin, seized power in Petrograd. This was a game-changer. The provisional government was overthrown, and Russia plunged into civil war. The Bolsheviks, with their vision of a global communist revolution, had no intention of granting genuine autonomy, let alone independence, to Ukraine. Faced with this stark reality, the Central Rada understood that the time for hesitation was over. On January 22, 1918, in Kyiv, they issued the Fourth Universal, a declaration of full and complete independence, establishing the Ukrainian People's Republic, UNR. Imagine the euphoria, the hope, the sheer audacity of this moment. After centuries of foreign domination, Ukraine was, for the first time in modern history, a sovereign state. They had their own government, their own army, their own dreams of a democratic future. But the dream was fragile, built on shifting sands. The newly declared UNR found itself immediately caught in a whirlwind of conflict. The Bolsheviks launched an invasion, seeing Ukraine as a crucial breadbasket and a gateway to Europe for their revolution. Kyiv itself fell briefly to the Red Army in February 1918, a period marked by brutal repression. The UNR government was forced to sign the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with the Central Powers, Germany and Austria-Hungary, to gain military support against the Bolsheviks, even though it meant German occupation of Ukraine for a time. This was a devil's bargain, a desperate measure to secure survival, but it highlighted the impossible choices facing Ukraine's nascent leadership. Meanwhile, the Austro-Hungarian Empire too was collapsing under the weight of the war. As its multi-ethnic fabric unravelled, the western Ukrainian lands of Galicia, Bukovina, and Transcarpathia saw their own push for self-determination. On November 1st, 1918, with the Habsburg monarchy dissolving, the Western Ukrainian People's Republic, Zuna, was proclaimed in Lviv. Its leader was Kyivan Petrushevich. This was another monumental moment, a parallel manifestation of the Ukrainian national spirit, born from the ashes of a different empire. The Zun, however, immediately faced its own existential threat. The newly independent Polish state, which also laid claim to Galicia, given its significant Polish population in cities like Lviv, a fierce and bloody war broke out between the Zuna and Poland, known as the Polish-Ukrainian War. Despite these immense external pressures, the two Ukrainian republics, born from different imperial collapses, recognized their shared heritage and destiny. On January 22, 1919, exactly 1 year after the UNR's declaration of independence, a historic event took place in Kyiv's St. Sophia Square, the Act of Unification, Akt Sluki, also known as Sobornost. The UNR and Zuna formally united, symbolically bringing together all Ukrainian lands into a single independent state. Imagine the scene. Thousands gathered, flags flying, the profound sense of hope and achievement. It was a powerful declaration to the world. Ukraine was one, and it demanded its place among the nations. But oh my friends, the tragedy that followed. This period, from 1917 to 1921, is known in Ukrainian history as the Ukrainian War of Independence, or sometimes, more starkly, as the Ukrainian Revolution. It was a multi-sided, chaotic and utterly devastating conflict. The unified Ukrainian state, led at various times by figures like Simon Petlura, a military commander who became the head of the Directorate, found itself fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously. The Bolsheviks, Red Army. Relentlessly pushing from the east, determined to incorporate Ukraine into their Soviet state. The White Russians, Denikin's volunteer army. Imperial Russian forces who sought to restore the old empire and saw Ukrainian independence as an act of treason. Poland, fighting for control of western Ukraine. Anarchist forces, led by figures like Nestor Makhno, who carved out their own territory and fought against all sides. Other foreign interventions. German, Austro-Hungarian, and later Entente forces, all with their own agendas. Picture this: a young, inexperienced Ukrainian army, often poorly equipped, fighting for its very survival against seasoned, larger and better resourced armies. The land was ravaged, the population caught in the middle, suffering unimaginable atrocities from all sides. The dream of a unified, independent Ukraine, so bravely declared, was being torn apart by the geopolitical realities of the day. The international community, still reeling from World War I and grappling with the Russian Civil War, offered little meaningful support to the fledgling Ukrainian state. They were more concerned with the larger struggle between Bolshevism and the old order, often viewing Ukraine as merely a pawn or a peripheral territory. By 1921, the impossible fight was over. The Ukrainian People's Republic, despite heroic efforts, was ultimately defeated. The Passau Treaty of Riga, 1921, signed between Soviet Russia and Soviet Ukraine as its proxy, and Poland formally partitioned Ukraine. The vast majority of Ukrainian territory, including Kiev and the historic Cossack lands, was absorbed into the newly formed Soviet Union as the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, Ukrainian SSR. This was a bitter pill to swallow. Independence lost, replaced by a new, equally oppressive imperial master. Western Ukraine fared little better. Galicia and parts of Volhynia became part of the newly independent Poland. Bukovina went to Romania, and Transcarpathia was incorporated into Czechoslovakia. So after this brief, brilliant flash of independence, Ukraine was once again divided, its people subjugated, and its national aspirations seemingly crushed. The act of unification, a powerful symbol of national unity, became a poignant reminder of what might have been, a testament to a dream that was realized for a moment, then snatched away. This period, my friends, is crucial. It wasn't just a defeat, it was a crucible. The experience of the War of Independence, the formation and collapse of the UNR and ZUN, the act of unification, these events indelibly etch the idea of a truly independent, united Ukrainian state into the national consciousness. Even as the Soviet Union began its brutal consolidation of power and Poland began its policies of Polonization in the West, the memory of that brief, blazing dawn of freedom would never truly fade. It would become a foundational myth, a rallying cry, a promise to future generations that the struggle for Sobornost, for unity and independence, was far from over. The stage was now set for a new, terrifying chapter. Life under Soviet rule and the ongoing struggle for identity under a different foreign power. But that, my friends, is a story for our next chapter. We left off with Ukraine once again divided, its brief, blazing taste of independence extinguished, its people parcelled out between new imperial masters. The vast majority, the fertile heartland, the Dniepro's embrace, found itself swallowed by the nascent Soviet Union, becoming the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. To the west, the historical lands of Galicia, Volhynia, and others were absorbed by Poland, Romania, and Czechoslovakia. It's a familiar story, isn't it? The ruiner revisited, but this time the stakes felt even higher, the forces even more formidable. The question that hangs in the air, the one that whispers through the wheat fields and the ancient forests, is this: how do you maintain a sense of self, a distinct identity, when the very ground beneath your feet is shifting, when your language, your history, your memory are under assault from multiple directions? Let's dive into the Ukrainian SSR first, because what unfolds there in the 1920s and 30s is a story of breathtaking cultural flowering, followed by an unimaginable descent into horror. When the Bolsheviks finally consolidated power, the early years of the Soviet Union brought a surprising, almost paradoxical policy to Ukraine: Ukrainizatsiya. This was part of a broader Soviet strategy called Korenizatsiya, quote Fisaforthius, aimed at building support for the new regime among non-Russian nationalities. For Ukraine, it meant a deliberate state-sponsored promotion of Ukrainian language, culture, and education. Imagine, after centuries of suppression under the Russian Empire, suddenly Ukrainian was the language of government, schools, and even the Red Army in Ukraine. It was a cultural explosion, what we now call the quote 45. Poets like Pavlo Tishina and Mykola Kivilovi, playwrights like Mykola Kulish, theatre directors like Les Kurbus, artists, scholars, they all flourished. They experimented with modernism, with new forms, drawing on both European avant-garde and their own rich folk traditions. They debated fiercely about Ukraine's path. Was it, quote, 46, quote, was it a distinct socialist nation? Universities were founded, publishing houses boomed, and Ukrainian intellectual life for a glorious fleeting decade was vibrant and fiercely independent. For a moment it felt like the dream of an independent Ukrainian culture, nurtured by Shevchenko and the Romedy, was finally being realized, albeit under the red banner of communism. The narrator in me, the one who loves to see a people find their voice, thrills at this period. It's a testament to the resilience of Ukrainian culture, always finding a way to bloom, even in the most unlikely of soils. But here's the thing that chills me to my core. This period of relative freedom was a calculated temporary maneuver. As Joseph Stalin consolidated his power in Moscow, the winds began to shift, turning from a gentle breeze into a howling gale of repression. The Soviet state, once seemingly tolerant, revealed its true totalitarian face. The quote 47. Anyone who dared to put Ukrainian identity before Soviet dogma became the enemy. The late 1920s saw the beginning of forced collectivization of agriculture. This wasn't just an economic policy. It was a brutal assault on the very fabric of Ukrainian society, especially its peasantry. For centuries, the Ukrainian farmer, the peasant, had been the bedrock of the nation, the keeper of its language, its traditions, its connection to the land. Stalin's regime sought to break this connection, to eliminate private land ownership, and to consolidate all farms into state-run collectives, kolkhozy. The rationale was ostensibly to modernize agriculture and feed the growing industrial workforce, but the methods were barbaric. Farmers who resisted, and many did fiercely, were labelled wealthy exploiters, even if they were just slightly more prosperous than their neighbours. They were stripped of their land, their homes, their livelihoods, and often deported to the Siberian gulags, or simply executed. This, quote, 49 was a campaign of terror designed to crush any independent spirit, any resistance to the state's will. And then came the Holodomor. The word itself means to kill by hunger. From 1932 to 1933, a man-made famine, engineered by the Soviet regime, swept across Ukraine, claiming the lives of millions. Think about that for a moment. Millions. This wasn't a natural disaster. It was a deliberate act of genocide, a weapon of mass destruction aimed squarely at the Ukrainian people. The state imposed impossibly high grain quotas on Ukrainian farmers, confiscating not just their surplus, but often every last kernel of grain, every potato, every vegetable. Special brigades scoured villages searching for hidden food, punishing those who tried to keep even a small reserve for their families. Borders were sealed, preventing starving Ukrainians from seeking food in other regions. Propaganda denied the very existence of the famine, while newspapers in the West, often influenced by Soviet sympathizers, remained silent or dismissed the reports as anti-Soviet lies. Imagine the horror. Fields ripe with grain guarded by armed soldiers, while people starved to death just meters away. Parents watching their children waste away, their bellies distended, their eyes vacant. Entire villages wiped out. People resorting to eating grass, bark, and even, in the most desperate cases, cannibalism. It's a horror that chills me to my core, a wound in the Ukrainian soul that has never fully healed. Why? Historians now widely agree that the Holodomor was not merely a consequence of collectivization, but a deliberate act of terror designed to crush Ukrainian national identity and resistance. It was an attempt to break the spirit of a people who had dared to dream of independence, who had shown a stubborn refusal to be fully assimilated into the Soviet mold. The Ukrainian peasantry, the backbone of that identity, was systematically starved into submission. As if the famine wasn't enough, the executed Renaissance was also brutally extinguished. The poets, writers, artists and scholars who had blossomed during Ukrainizatsiya were now rounded up, imprisoned or executed. Mykola Kavilovi, the impassioned advocate for a distinct Ukrainian path, committed suicide in 1933, a defiant act against the looming terror. Les Kurbas, the visionary theatre director, was shot in the Sandomok forest in 1937, along with hundreds of other Ukrainian intellectuals, writers and artists. Libraries were purged, books burned, and historical narratives rewritten to fit the Soviet dogma. The goal was clear: to create a Soviet-Ukrainian identity, stripped of its independent historical memory, its cultural distinctiveness, its very soul. It was a period of profound darkness, a systematic attempt to erase a nation. Meanwhile, in the western lands of Ukraine, life under Polish, Romanian and Czechoslovakian rule offered a different, though also challenging set of circumstances. These were not totalitarian regimes on the scale of the Soviet Union, but they were certainly not benevolent rulers either. In Poland, particularly in Galicia and Volhynia, Ukrainians faced policies of Polonization. Ukrainian schools were closed or Polonized, land reforms favoured Polish settlers, and Ukrainians were often discriminated against in public office and economic life. The Greek Catholic Church, however, became an even stronger bulwark of Ukrainian identity, a spiritual and cultural sanctuary in a hostile environment. It was in this crucible of Polish oppression that more radical forms of Ukrainian nationalism began to take root. The Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, OUN, was formed in 1929, advocating for an independent Ukrainian state through revolutionary struggle, including violent means. Figures like Kyivan Rus and later Stepan Bandera emerged as leaders. The OUN's methods were often controversial, including assassinations of Polish officials, but for many it represented a desperate fight for survival and self-determination against what they perceived as existential threats from both East and West. It's a complex and often tragic chapter, where the yearning for freedom was so intense that it pushed some to extreme measures. In Romanian Bukovina and Bessarabia, Ukrainians faced similar pressures of Romanization, while in Czechoslovakian Transcarpathia, the situation was somewhat more lenient, allowing for greater cultural development, though still within the confines of a minority status. So, as the 1930s drew to a close, Ukraine remained a fractured land, its people enduring different forms of subjugation. In the Soviet East, the scars of the Holodomor and the purges ran deep, a constant agonizing reminder of the price of resistance. In the Polish West, a simmering anger and a radicalized nationalism brewed, fueled by a desire for a truly independent state. And then the world plunged into another abyss. In August 1939, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression treaty that included secret protocols carving up Eastern Europe. Poland, once again, was the primary victim. Its eastern territories, home to millions of Ukrainians, were designated for Soviet IK. Quote, 54. Just weeks later, on September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland, igniting World War II. On September 17th, the Red Army marched into eastern Poland, ostensibly to, quote, 54, quote, the Belarusian and Ukrainian populations. For the first time since the Treaty of Riga, the vast majority of Ukrainian lands were brought under a single political entity, the Ukrainian SSR. This, quote, 55 was met with a mix of emotions. Some Ukrainians, particularly those who had suffered under Polish rule, initially welcomed the Soviet troops, seeing them as liberators. But that fleeting relief quickly evaporated as the Soviet system, with its secret police, its collectivization, and its purges, was brutally imposed on the newly acquired territories. The intelligentsia, the clergy, and anyone deemed a, quote, 56 were arrested, deported, or executed. The horrors of the Holodomor and the executed Renaissance, which had been carefully concealed from Western Ukraine, now became a terrifying reality. Ukraine, the ancient land of crossroads and constant flux, was now, quote, 57, quote, under the iron fist of the Soviet Union. But this was no peaceful unification. It was a temporary, brutal consolidation, achieved through cynical pacts and military might, setting the stage for an even more devastating conflict to come. The whispers of freedom, though suppressed, never truly died, and as the world prepared for total war, Ukraine found itself once again on the very front lines, a battleground for empires, a crucible where its fate would be forged anew. Okay, my friends, if you've been with me on this epic journey so far, you know that Ukraine, this incredible land, has never been a stranger to the crucible of conflict. It's a place where empires collide, where ideologies clash, and where the very earth seems to remember the footsteps of countless armies. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared it for what was coming next. We left off with a terrifying quote, 58, the lands of Ukraine, fractured for centuries, now largely brought under one roof, but that roof was the Soviet Union, and the architect was Stalin. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, that cynical agreement between two totalitarian giants, had carved up Eastern Europe, and Ukraine was once again the prize. Western Ukraine, which had endured Polish rule, suddenly found itself under the Red Banner. The sigh of relief some might have felt at escaping Polish landlords quickly turned to a gasp of horror as Soviet secret police, forced collectivization, and purges swept through. It was a brutal taste of what their Eastern brethren had already suffered. But this fragile, forced unity, drenched in blood and suspicion, was just the prelude to a storm of unprecedented fury. Imagine the air, thick with a dread you can almost taste, a silent countdown ticking. Because on June 22nd, 1941, that countdown exploded, Operation Barbarossa. Suddenly, the German war machine, the Wehrmacht, roared across the Soviet border, unleashing the largest land invasion in human history. And where did the main thrust of this colossal, devastating war take place? You guessed it, Ukraine. This wasn't just a battleground. It was the very heart of the Eastern Front, a place destined to become synonymous with total war, with a scale of destruction that beggars belief. For many Ukrainians, especially in the western regions, the initial arrival of the Germans was met with a complex, often desperate mix of emotions. Remember the Holodomor? Remember the purges, the executed Renaissance, the systematic destruction of Ukrainian identity under Stalin. To some, the Germans, monstrous as they were, seemed like a potential liberator from an even more immediate personal terror. They held out a desperate hope that perhaps, just perhaps, this new power would allow for the realization of a truly independent Ukraine. This hope, however fleeting, was quickly and brutally extinguished. The Nazis weren't coming to liberate. They were coming to conquer, to exploit, to enslave, and to exterminate. Their ideology, General Plan Ost, envisioned Ukraine as the ultimate, quote 59, Lebensraum for the German people, its fertile black earth the breadbasket of their new empire. The Ukrainian people themselves were deemed Untermenschen, subhuman, destined for forced labour, starvation, or extermination to make way for German colonists. The horrors unfolded with dizzying speed. Within weeks, Kyiv fell. The scale of the Red Army's defeat was catastrophic, but the cost to civilians was even more profound. The Holocaust, that darkest chapter of human history, came to Ukraine with unparalleled ferocity. Mass executions of Jews began almost immediately after the German invasion. The most infamous, of course, is Babi Yar, a ravine outside Kyiv, where in just 2 days in September 1941, over 33,000 Jewish men, women and children were systematically murdered by the Einsatzgruppen and their collaborators. But Babi Yar was not unique. It was one of thousands of such sites across Ukraine, a landscape scarred by mass graves. Life under Nazi occupation became a nightmare of forced labour, starvation, and constant terror. Ukrainian men and women were rounded up and sent to work in German factories and farms as Ostarbeiter. Villages were burned, reprisals for partisan activity were swift and brutal, and the agricultural bounty of the land was systematically plundered to feed the German war machine, leaving Ukrainians to starve. It was a hellish choice for the people of Ukraine. Caught between two totalitarian powers, Stalin's Soviet Union and Hitler's Third Reich, both of whom viewed them as expendable resources or ideological enemies, this wasn't just a war. It was a war of annihilation fought on and over the bodies of Ukrainians. But even in this unimaginable darkness, the dream of an independent Ukraine refused to die. This is where we encounter the complex and often controversial story of Ukrainian nationalism during the war. The Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, OUN, which had been active in western Ukraine before the war, initially saw the Germans as potential allies against the Soviets. When the Germans invaded, factions of the OUN, led by figures like Stepan Bandera and Andriy Melnik, attempted to establish a Ukrainian state. On June 30th, 1941, in Lviv, the Bandera faction, OUNB, proclaimed the restoration of an independent Ukrainian state. The Germans, however, had no intention of allowing a sovereign Ukraine. They quickly arrested Bandera and other OUN leaders, sending them to concentration camps. This betrayal led to a profound shift within the nationalist movement. Disillusioned, and facing the brutal reality of Nazi occupation, many OUN members turned against the Germans. This is the birth of the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, or UPA, Ukrainska Povstanska Armia. Formed largely in 1942 to 1943, the UPA became a formidable, if controversial, force. Imagine this: a guerrilla army, operating out of the dense forests of western Ukraine, fighting on multiple fronts. They fought the Nazis, they fought the Soviets, and in some tragic instances, they fought Polish civilians in ethnic cleansing campaigns, particularly in Volhynia, which led to immense suffering and loss of life. This part of the history is incredibly painful and complex, a stark reminder of how war can twist and brutalize even those fighting for freedom. The UPA's goal was clear: an independent, sovereign Ukraine, free from both German and Soviet domination. Their slogan, "Freedom for Ukraine or Death," encapsulated their fierce determination. Meanwhile, a separate Soviet partisan movement also emerged, often competing with and clashing violently against the UPA, as both sought to control territory and influence the local population. The forests and villages became a deadly chessboard, where alliances were temporary and loyalties were constantly tested, often with fatal consequences. As the tide of the war turned, and the Red Army began its slow, grinding and incredibly costly counter-offensive from 1943 onwards, Ukraine became the scene of some of the most ferocious battles of the entire war. The Dnieper River, that ancient artery of Ukraine, became a defensive line of immense strategic importance, with battles raging for months, costing millions of lives. Kyiv was liberated in November 1943, but the cost was staggering. When the Red Army finally drove the last German forces out of Ukraine, in October 1944, the land was utterly devastated. The statistics are almost incomprehensible. Ukraine lost between 8 and 10 million people during World War II, a staggering 1/5 of its population. This includes soldiers, partisans, victims of the Holocaust, civilian casualties, and those who died from starvation and disease. Over 700 cities and towns and 28,000 villages were destroyed. The industrial heartland was in ruins, its infrastructure shattered. This wasn't just a setback, it was an existential catastrophe. But here's the thing that blows my mind. Even as the war ended, the fighting didn't stop for everyone. For the UPA, the Yasti '62 Erskaz by the Red Army simply meant a continuation of their struggle against a different occupier. They continued their guerrilla war against Soviet rule well into the 1950s, a testament to their unwavering commitment to an independent Ukraine, even in the face of overwhelming odds. The Soviets in turn unleashed brutal repression, deporting hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians, especially from western Ukraine, to the Gulag in Siberia. Families were torn apart, communities shattered, all in an effort to crush any lingering embers of Ukrainian nationalism. The end of World War II fundamentally reshaped Ukraine. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact's territorial changes were largely formalized. The Ukrainian SSR, for the first time in centuries, encompassed the vast majority of ethnic Ukrainian lands, from the Carpathians to the Donbass, and now including Crimea, transferred from the Russian SFSR in 1954, a move we will definitely explore later. It was a unified Ukraine, yes, but unified under the iron fist of the Soviet Union. The war had left an indelible scar, a collective trauma that would shape generations. The memory of the Holodomor was still fresh, now compounded by the horrors of Nazi occupation and the immense sacrifices made in the Great Patriotic War. For the Soviet government, this war became a foundational myth, one that emphasized the unity of Soviet peoples and the heroism of the Red Army. Ukrainian nationalism, especially the UPA, was demonized and suppressed, its narrative twisted to fit Soviet ideology. Yet, beneath the surface of Soviet uniformity, the seeds of a distinct Ukrainian identity, forged in the fires of two totalitarian occupations and an unyielding desire for freedom, continued to germinate. The war had been a brutal, paradoxical unifier, bringing disparate regions of Ukraine together under one political entity, albeit one that denied their true sovereignty. The question now was, how would Ukraine rebuild? And more importantly, how would the spirit of independence, so brutally suppressed, find new ways to manifest in the decades of Soviet rule that stretched ahead? This colossal struggle, this unimaginable suffering, imprinted itself deeply on the Ukrainian psyche. It taught them the price of freedom, the cost of vulnerability, and the enduring power of resilience. It set the stage for the next long chapter, a chapter of quiet resistance, cultural preservation, and the slow, arduous path towards a future where Ukraine could finally truly be its own. And that, my friends, is where our next journey begins, into the complex, often hidden world of Soviet Ukraine.